Hello, everyone. This is Syria Face to Face, episode 5. I think it's episode 5. Welcome. It's Sunday, January 27th. And my name is Janice Courtcamp, and I will be talking with you tonight about Syria. Again, very briefly, I've traveled to Syria 6 times over the past 2.5, almost 3 years now, and have really devoted my life for the last 6 years to studying and researching both the country and the conflict, and then other issues that have to do with conflicts in the Middle East. Well, welcome. I see a lot of people. Hi, everybody. Tonight we're going to be doing part 2 of why is the U.S. in Syria? And it's a complicated thing. I spent an hour last week trying to describe some of the reasons that were there. You know, the primary one that we talked about last week was because this is what the U.S. does, is it's war, and also to pander to regional allies. And we'll build on those themes a little bit more tonight. But really, good evening. Really what I want to focus on is more of, everybody and their brother is in Syria. And so we're going to try to reduce that as much as we can to understand the basic core of the conflict. And what I really try to do, details are very important, and verifications, evidence, etc. I have all of that. And so it's difficult to take the time during one of these presentations to present each and every piece of evidence that I have to back up what I'm saying. And this is why your questions and comments are so important. I've found that it's difficult for me to do that on the fly because I'll be in the middle of a thought. Somebody will ask a good question. It scrolls off the page. It's hard for me to find it again, and so I apologize for that. But I do go in. I'll either go in tonight or tomorrow morning and answer each and every comment that everyone leaves. And really always thankful for the words of encouragement and support. So again, this is part 2 of why the U.S. is in Syria, why everybody else is in Syria. But I wanted to start out with a story or two because these are actually germane to the topic. Syria, of course, is ancient. It's an ancient land. It's an ancient geopolitical entity. And in fact, while many people talk about it being artificially created after World War II, that, of course, is nonsense. Since there have been civilizations, there has been a geopolitical entity known as Syria. We're talking thousands of years BC. In their Independence Day is celebrated in April of 1946. But a year before that, that was when the French finally left. A year before that, in 1945, something happened that I find fascinating and really illustrates to me a lot of what is going on in the problem that we're seeing in Syria right now. In 1945, the UN was meeting, and Syria was one of the founding nation states of the UN, as a matter of fact. Their first ambassador to the UN was a man by the name of Faris Khoury, and he's very well known in Syria, highly respected man of their history. He was a Christian man, brilliant guy, and like I said, he was their first ambassador. At that first meeting of the UN, there were 53 original members. The shrewdness, the astuteness, the brilliance of Ambassador Khoury's speeches and remarks led one U.S. diplomat to say, it is impossible for a country with men like these to be occupied. And of course, this was at the end of the French occupation, and Syria would be granted, at the benevolence of the colonial powers, a recognition of their independence. But I'll tell you a story about Mr. Khoury that I love. The French ambassador had risen from his seat, and Mr. Khoury went over and sat in the French ambassador's chair. And the French ambassador came back and he noticed that Mr. Coury was in his chair and he was getting more and more upset and belligerent. And Mr. Coury was just very calmly sitting there and watching his watch. And after about 25 minutes, Mr. Coury stood up and said to the French representative, "You could not bear me sitting in your chair for a mere 25 minutes. Your country has occupied mine for more than 25 years. Hasn't the time of your troops' departure come yet?" And it notes in the Wikipedia reference to this story that the process of Syria's independence started in that same UN session. So well done, Ambassador Coury. As I mentioned, Syria is an ancient civilization, and this is actually very important to what we're seeing today. If you're a history buff, archaeology buff like I am, there are few places, if any, on Earth that can match it for just the richness of the archaeological, the ruins there, the historical places there that you can visit and see and touch. Absolutely fascinating history. As I said, Syria has basically been known as Syria since civilizations began and people began writing about things called civilizations. With civilizations came empires, and with empires came wars, didn't they? Well, let me just tell you that Syria has been coveted, desired, attacked, invaded, occupied by empires in their wars since the very first empires started warring, the Egyptians and the Hittites. And so it went throughout history. Whereas Syria is, literally in the heart of the Middle East, which is in the heart of the traffic north and south, and often east and west, with shipping around the Mediterranean, what have you, and to points east. So they're in that area of the world that's been the crossroads of the world, and of course was the great Silk Road path went through Syria. And so all of these empires have gone through, many of them were pushed out, many of them simply evaporated over time. And yet Syria still exists. And yes, borders have expanded and contracted, etc., over the course of history. But Syria as a geopolitical entity still exists. And this is what's really important for us to understand, is that this war that's happening right now is simply another one of those kinds of wars where you have major dominant powers trying to attack it, weaken it, take control of it, occupy it, etc. This is actually what's going on now. And what's interesting, another thing that's interesting, is that because of that history, it's my opinion that they can see an empire coming from 5,000 miles away. They can recognize when a global power wants to take control of it. And this is something that has given them strength in order to resist what's been happening there for the last 8 years. And I'll explain that a little bit more detailed later. Talking about history and archaeology, I got to go to Homs, of course, and outside of Homs, on the road to Tartus, about halfway between those two cities, is the famous Crac de Chevalier, the Crac de Chevalier Castle. This is one of the most famous Crusader castles in the world. It was built around 1100, I guess. It's huge. I think it's the largest Crusader castle in the world. It was built on a hilltop, of course, and it's overlooking the plain. You just have a huge vista from that beautiful area overlooking the plain to home city. It also overlooks a beautiful valley called Wadi al-Nasara, which is the Valley of the Christians. Absolutely gorgeous spot. Several villages there that are predominantly Christian, and beautiful place. Hi, Sana. And so I was at Cactus Chevalier, and a couple of thoughts were going through my mind. It was interesting because, we were the only ones there. I was there with one of my groups, and that is heartbreaking, because before the war, of course, it would have been packed with people, tourists from Syria and from all over the world, with school kid groups there on field trips, etc. But on that day, and many of the other times that I've visited, we basically had it to ourselves, which is a very luxurious feeling, but it's still sad that that's the case. So I was up at the very top part of the castle, and I was looking over to the town of Safita, which I believe is about 70 kilometers. I have not double-checked that, but it's quite a distance. You could see the town of Safita and see this white tower of the castle that's there in that town. And I asked the guide, did they signal from tower to tower? And he said, yes, they signal fires so that the one castle could warn the other that they were under attack or what have you. And that would be true all the way down the Crusader line of castles, as the Crusaders were occupying Syria at that time. And, I just had this thought there. And here I am at this incredible, magnificent structure, but it was just another one of many struggles between empires, and of course, people talk about the Mohammedans expanding and building their empire, and that's true. But there's this kind of mentality that because they were Muslims, it was more dangerous than any other or worse than any other, and that's simply not true. Study the Mongols, study the Romans, study the British Empire. Empires are, as entities are building empires, they are quite brutal about it. And then, of course, the Crusaders came down, and, it was just a brutal, awful mess. But what I'm saying is, it was one of many, and Syria still stands. It's one of the Crac de Chevalier Castle is one of those remnants that's left behind of empires that have come and gone from trying to occupy and control Syria. I think as we go into why the U.S. is in Syria and expand on that, there are a couple of primary things that it's important, kind of key words to think about. The first key word is hypocrisy. And the second key term, I guess you would say, is conspiracy theorist. So I'm actually going to hit the second term first, which is conspiracy theorist. And folks, we need to deflate the importance that this term has gathered over the recent years. Because if you seriously consider what that means, a conspiracy is nothing more than a plan, usually a plan of deception, that involves multiple parties. Okay? If you have been involved in planning a surprise party for someone, you actually are a member of a conspiracy. They happen every single day, both on that kind of personal fun level, but also on a very serious global scale as well, particularly now in this day and age of the high technology, the globalization of so much of our world, the intertwining and the interconnectivity of it. I just want you to know that conspiracies are the stuff that make up a lot of geopolitical history, and most particularly in the modern era. And of course, the word theory really is based on the scientific method, where someone has put forth an hypothesis, an idea, and then their peers will examine it and evaluate it and try to verify it or not verify it, what have you. But there is a process that's involved of moving a hypothesis into being called a theory, which has a gravitas, a weight of peer review and examination, and has become, at least to many, a somewhat accepted theory. So this is what happens involving theories of geopolitical activity as well. And this is one of the things that has been so powerful about the online world, and Facebook and Twitter and the web itself. You know, yes, of course, it's opened up Pandora's box of people having theories that range from, anyway, you know what I'm talking about, pretty far out there, crazy stuff, to people actually just questioning narratives and what has been given to us through media and government sources of so-called facts and truth, which in reality don't match up to actual facts and truth. And so those of us who have been trying to diligently and with integrity look at each of these things with fresh eyes and say, is this true? Is this not true? We're the ones getting branded as the wackos and the loonies, when in fact, this is what everybody should be doing. As an American, of course, it's my duty to hold my government accountable for its words and actions, isn't it? And this is why we have this thing called the Bill of Rights. It actually protects people like me and all of anyone else out there in America, that we have the right and actually the responsibility to hold our government accountable. It's supposed to protect us in that process, that we have the right to freedom of speech and protest, for example. So I take that very seriously. For all the problems and the mess and the lies and everything that have occurred through American history, that document is something that I hold pretty dear. I think that's an important piece of paper. So, I was hoping to have a balloon here and actually blow up the balloon and poke it with a pin and say, so much for conspiracy theorists being a bad word. Just let that go, because it's nonsense. The other term that's going to come up again and again tonight is hypocrisy. And a few months ago, I think before I left on the last trip to Syria, I asked people on my Facebook page, I said, when did you wake up? Can you tell me your story? And I was shocked. I mean, I got so many responses to that. I actually have it in a Word document. I'll try to format it and send it out to everybody. But one after another, after another person came on and was just telling me these fabulous stories of what got them to kind of wake up to the idea that these wars have been based on lies about government and media propaganda, what have you. My wake up had to do with seeing the hypocrisy of what the U.S. was about in Syria. And it's a hard process. It's time consuming, it's difficult, it's confusing, and most of all, it's really gut wrenching. It's awful. It is, can be kind of mind melting and soul sucking and all of those things, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. No regrets of really digging in and finding out about this stuff, because I'd rather be awake than in a coma, and not knowing these things. So my wake up, as I said, was a hypocrisy that I noted early on in the war against Syria, and this is what it was. I knew enough about Saudi Arabia to know that this thing called the Arab Spring, this was back in 2012, that Saudi Arabia was one of the countries in the world in greatest need of freedom and democracy. And yet there was very little even stirring there. And that made me curious. And then, you see these other countries kind of falling under this spell of this Arab Spring and a real domino effect. And after Colonel Gaddafi was killed in Libya, I was more and more intrigued by what was going on, and I was trying to research and figure things out. And that was the time, it was the end of 2012. Yes, Louis, Al-Hosn Castle. That was the end of 2012, and President Assad of Syria had given an interview with RT, which is Russia Today. It's just called RT. And it made me curious because I was researching the Arab Spring, kind of wondering what was going on, and President Assad had given this interview when I had really pictured him as kind of Saddam Hussein style, with long fingernails and a beard, kind of hunkered in a bunker somewhere. I've never seen a picture of him that I know. And so I thought I would watch this interview. I had actually never heard of RT before. And a lot of Americans have no idea what that is. So I started watching it, and I was immediately struck. I told this story many times, but about 2 or 3 minutes into that interview, I just thought, gosh, if this is the one guy we can't get along with in the Middle East, I'm missing something. I really felt immediately that he was telling the truth. And what he was saying were things like, the West is against him. If the West is against you, and all these other countries are against you, and you don't have the support of the people of Syria, how can you stay in power? He's talking about himself. He said anybody, in theory, he was saying anybody could be president. I mean, there are certain restrictions, but a lot of people could be president in Syria, but he was born in Syria and he would die in Syria. And I'm just watching this interview, and it's just kind of like, kind of shaking up my neural pathways because it wasn't making sense to me. And when I was watching him, he just made me realize that I knew nothing about the Middle East. It made me intrigued to know more, to find out if my gut feeling that he was telling the truth in that interview. I encourage you to look it up. It's was from, I think, September of 2012 with Sophie Shevardnadze of RT. And it just made me want to know more. And I became immediately obsessed and just started spending virtually all day, every day studying Syria. And if you're interested in the history of Syria, this little book, actually it's kind of a big, thick book, was written by Philip Hitti, Hitti. It's called History of Syria. I take this with me on all my trips as a reference for the ancient history stuff, and I recommend it. From what I know and from people I've talked to, this is a pretty well-known and respected resource. Okay, so I'm kind of telling my story of a wake-up call because I want to get back to why the U.S. is in Syria. Because at that point, I believed the narratives that were being told to me on the media and from the government that the little old US of A had donned our white hat, were playing John Wayne, and we were involved in Syria because there was this big, nasty, evil dictator, and he was killing his own people, and we had to go save the people and the children of Syria. And I thought, wow, even to that point, this is late 2012, after all the mess, the death and destruction that had come on Iraq, after the war in Libya, I'm still thinking in my little American brain, oh, that we're the good guys and we're trying to be good guys and we're doing something good over there. The answer to the question of why is the U.S. doing in Syria, what is the U.S. doing in Syria, the answer is absolutely nothing good. Absolutely nothing good. There is not one thing that you have been told in mainstream media or from our government that bears resemblance to reality in Syria and what's been happening. I kind of ran out of my notes here. I was wrestling all week with how to present this to you. But, I've talked about these things many times, and we're going to go over it. What you have that's happening in Syria right now remember those stories of how Syria has been coveted and invaded, etc., by empires, since there were such things as empires. Well, what you have in Syria is you have an aggressor group and you have a defender. The aggressor group consists of the US, Israel, the UK, France, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and a host of other countries that you're like, what in the world are these people doing being involved in Syria? On that side, on the side, we'll just call it the side of the West, so it's led by the US, primarily for the interests of Israel, which we'll talk again about in a minute, and Saudi, but it's all of these other countries, including countries like Norway, the Netherlands, Denmark, Australia, Germany, Jordan, and many other countries have been involved. In fact, I think Poland wanted to send troops at one point to Syria. So that group is what I call the aggressor. The defender is, of course, the sovereign, independent nation of Syria. Its independence was finally acknowledged by colonial powers, as I said, in 1945-46. Syria intends to be an independent sovereign nation. In other words, they want all of these big powers to not sit in their chair. Does that make sense? They want to sit in their own chair, run their own affairs, and their own country. It's interesting to note that after Syria got its independence in 1946, in 1949, the CIA attempted its first coup against the democratically elected leader of Syria in 1949. And we've been mucking around in there ever since. So those are the aggressors, the US, the West, and its regional allies. And then you have the defender, which is Syria. And as Syria became more and more under attack and things were looking more and more dangerous, first Hezbollah came in at Syria's request, Iran and Russia. Those entities, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, were invited into Syria to help them combat the proxy armies that were created and supported, funded, and armed by the West, the aggressor countries. I hope this is making sense. Aggressor and defender. So the aggressor countries, again, the US and all of its friends, actually started this particular action against Syria. It was planned in the 1990s, as a matter of fact, late 80s, early 90s. There's actually a document that you can get on the CIA website, and it has to do with how to take down Syria. It was written in 1987, I think, 1984, something like that. It's basically the same blueprint that we saw happening in this war, where the violence began 8 years ago. So in the late 80s, there were plans drawn up to undermine the government of Syria and take control basically over Syria by installing a puppet government that was friendly to the West. 1990s, those plans became even more so. There were several plans floating around, all involving taking out Iraq and Syria. And there was another plan called the Oded-Yanan plan out of Israel that actually called for something that's referred to now as the New Middle East, which was taking the strong countries that were not aligned, not puppets of the West in that game, but to literally take those countries and split them apart into small, weak states, loosely based on, sectarian lines. So you'd have a Sunni land and an Alawite land and a Kurd land and, Shiite land, all of these things. And that was the Oded-Yanan plan out of Israel, also called the New Middle East plan. That was referred to by Condoleezza Rice and others later. So keep thinking the New Middle East, and what the overall conspiratorial plan is by the Western powers to literally change the face of the Middle East and put it under dominion. So you had those plans in the 90s. Then in 2000, George Bush came into office. And at that time also is when President Bashar al-Assad of Syria came into office as well. Of course, his father had been president for decades before that. President Bashar took over the reins on the death of his father. He was not the one that was supposed to. The one that had been groomed for this was his older brother, Basil, who died in an automobile crash. Bashar al-Assad, of course, had studied ophthalmology, was an ophthalmologist living in London. Before President Hafez died, and after the death of the older brother, Bashar was recalled to Syria, and he began working with his father that time to get kind of groomed for leadership later. And that was about a 6-year period where he learned really the inner workings of everything that was going on. And Hafez was known worldwide as a very shrewd leader. In fact, very able to hold his own against people like Henry Kissinger, for example. They're fascinating accounts of President Hafez interacting with Western leaders. Jimmy Carter had a great deal of respect for him, etc. So Bashar learned the ropes from his father. There are two very different personalities. And he took over at the death of his father in 2000. So you had George Bush coming to power, and you had President Bashar al-Assad coming to power in 2000. In 2001, this event happened called 9/11. And as we talked about last week, people around the world will say the world changed that day. We know in America it certainly changed for us, didn't it? Stupid people like me kind of went hook, line, and sinker for all this stuff about how we're gonna have this war on terror, and if you're not for us, you're against us, and we're just gonna go out there and we're gonna put our American boot up everybody's butt, and we're gonna wipe out terrorism. And I'm like, I had 2 little kids at the time, and Mama Bear comes out and it's like, yeah, get those guys. Well, the thing is that those neocons that came in under George W. Bush, they used that. We can talk about 9/11 some other day. Whatever anybody thinks happened there, the consequences of that event are that the neocons who came to power under George W. Bush had a blank check to do whatever they wanted, anywhere they wanted in the world, and they went after Iraq. And they took out Iraq. But at that time, right after 9/11, we know the plan was sent around the Pentagon that we were planning to take down 7 countries in 5 years: Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Iraq, starting with Iraq, Sudan, Somalia, ending with Iran. And so the neocons were just full out bent on just going to war wherever they wanted to go to war on. And, this is when we ended up getting all those crazy lies about Saddam Hussein, who was our guy since he was in his teens. The CIA had been using him. We went after Saddam Hussein under the guise of so-called weapons of mass destruction, and that literally destabilized the entirety of the Middle East. And it just created this domino effect of problems and catastrophes. Yes, somebody is saying, Michael Robertson is saying, it's all the usual suspects, and it is always the usual suspects. It's these so-called leaders of the free world who have dismal, pitiful support ratings. Nobody trusts them. I mean, how many people do you know that actually trust their leader if you're in Australia or UK or Canada or America or France? I mean, their approval ratings are abysmal, but they're referred to themselves as the leaders of the free world and the international community. They're made up of the US, which is the current empire of the world. We have military bases all around the world, about 900 of them. The sun never sets on our military empire. We have huge economic power in the world. We have huge power as far as media in the world. And of course, between the US and UK and Europe, the world's banking system is ruled between those powers as well. So you have, again, the aggressor nations wanting to take out little old Syria to create this, like they took out Iraq, to create this thing called the New Middle East, which is where any state that could not be put under the thumb of the US and its buddies would be taken out, taken full control over, or literally ripped apart into little tiny countries that could never have a large army and could never be a threat to anybody and could be manipulated. There would be constant wars that would constantly feed the arms makers' profit margins. This was just thought of as a win-win for everybody. But folks, bringing freedom, bringing democracy, bringing stability, helping the people of the region were never a part of any of those calculations and plans. Never. It doesn't enter into it anywhere. That's what I mean when I say the aggressor nations, what they're doing in Syria is absolutely no good. There's nothing about it that is any good, that should get any kind of support. Again, the reason we want to control the Middle East is for primarily natural resources, the oil and the natural gas, not just for petroleum for the U.S. We suck up the lion's share of the oil and gas in the world, 25 to 30%, but to control the profits from sales of gas and oil from the Middle East into Europe and emerging markets like Asia. I mean, we're talking trillions of dollars. And so there's just greed involved. As I mentioned before, it's a strategic geographic region. It's a crossroads, a critical crossroads. So they wanted to control it that way. If you control the Middle East, you can isolate Russia and China and lock them out of profits from energy sales in the region and that sort of thing. So there's this whole grand strategy. But please don't ever delude yourself that there is any care or concern for people getting starved and slaughtered in Yemen, for example, for the at least 1 million that died in Iraq, hundreds of thousands of children from sanctions. For the refugees, all the 10 million or more people that were driven from their homes that ended up, many of them trying to get into Europe, it's going to be, it's going to cause issues for Europe for generations to come. It's just a massive influx of people. Some of those people are, in fact, battle-hardened, tried and true terrorists. I mean, they've been fighting in Syria for 8 years. A lot of the refugees support the terrorist ideology, and then you have a huge number of them that just want to live in peace and work and be good citizens wherever they end up. I mean, it's a spectrum, but there is a percentage of that group that went into Europe that is most likely going to cause huge problems. So none of these catastrophic consequences are priorities or concerns for the powers that be who are making these decisions to start these wars and actions in the Middle East. And this is the point that I'm kind of driving into the ground here. But I'm hoping that this is making sense. So you have this huge push after 9/11 to make this new Middle East. We had invaded Iraq. We had gone after Libya. Or no, not before Libya. But in the mid-2000s, we decided to really go after Syria. And we kind of gave a chance to President Bashar al-Assad in 2004 to kind of get in line with what the U.S. was doing or not. And at the time, he said, no, I don't accept dictates. They wanted him to kind of end his alliance and relationship with Iran and with the resistance, the Palestinian resistance. So that would be, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas and Hezbollah. So he was basically warned in 2004, you either submit to our dictates or we're coming after you. And in 2005, we started doing exactly that. In 2006, there was a cable from the embassy in Damascus outlining our plan to undermine the Syrian government. And from 2006 to 2010, the U.S., the CIA was literally training and spending millions of dollars training what they call citizen journalists to create these false narratives. How do you build a revolution? Well, one of the ways you do it is you pay and you train activists to go to Syria and people on the ground to actually, foment revolution. And this is one of the things we did. After, we were enlisting the aid of the Saudis and Qatar. Arms, weapons were getting sent into Syria. They were being stored at mosques that were radicalized or paid for by the Saudis or staffed by the Saudis and Qatar. So there were guns and weapons being stored at the mosques. And you're just kind of waiting for the spark to hit and the flames to start flying and the violence to start. And that's what happened in March 2011. At the same time, as you're seeing this stuff unfold in Venezuela right now, go back to 2011, and what had happened was the same leaders of the free world, the US, the UK, France, blah, 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 all said President Assad is illegitimate. We do not recognize him as the leader of Syria. We recognize this so-called political opposition as the only true representatives of the Syrian people. Well, the Syrian people, the Syrian opposition that were being called the legitimate representatives of the Syrian people didn't even live in Syria, folks. These guys were people that had left Syria often, 20, 30 years before. And they, many of them were members of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. It's an outlawed organization, but it's an underground organization there. So these guys not only didn't live in Syria, many of them hadn't for decades, some of them actually had never lived in Syria, and yet they were called the legitimate representatives of the Syrian people. And this is who the Western powers, these aggressor powers, called the government of Syria. Well, that gang, had no support in Syria whatsoever. I mean, like a half dozen people might vote for one of those guys if they should ever be on a ballot for president. But this is the narrative that was given to us by the government and media, that these were the good guys and they were the ones that we were supporting to bring freedom and democracy to Syria. So that was the political goings on. The U.S. also at the same time was using tremendous economic pressure with horrible punishing sanctions against Syria to isolate it from the financial world and the global financial system. And then there was this propaganda war that we were getting in the media, kind of telling all these crazy things about Syria. So it's a multi-frontal war. It's the political with the expat opposition, it's the media with the propaganda, it's the diplomatic stuff that's going on in the UN. And then there's these covert activities that are going on with the CIA and State Department, literally helping to run weapons to militants there, stockpiling them in mosques, training these militants and preparing them for guerrilla, a violent rebellion. And finally, all of that came to a head. And in March 2011, the violence broke out. And wham, everybody was ready to start the false narratives. Oh, President Assad brutally put down peaceful protesters. No, he didn't. From the beginning, those creeps that were being helped and supported by the CIA and State Department were ready with their guns to fire into the crowds to create chaos. The Syrian army, the Syrian security forces, were not allowed to carry armed weapons for months after the violence began. They were in there with batons. The U.S., I see I have somebody here to help me with my break. The U.S. was literally arming, funding, supporting, training various and sundry armed proxy terrorist groups to literally terrorize the population of Syria, put them under submission, to get them to cower and surrender to these terrorist militants. I mean, this just goes on and on and on. But we're going to take a break there for 1 second. My husband Sid is here with my all-time favorite drink from Syria. I need to catch my breath. Sid, hi. Thank you. And tonight we're going to introduce you to a very special thing. You're going to come around the side.
Good evening. Good evening.
This is a hot drink. It's called mate. It actually comes from South America. It's only become popular in Syria, I think, over the last 100 years ago, but it's very, very popular there. Many of my most memorable conversations and times have been spent drinking mate. And
I'll get it for you in 1 second.
Okay, what did you want to say, dear?
Well, I just wanted to say hello.
He's
I'm much better. Not as hideous as I was last week. And so the wife says tonight's feature is mate. Well, I've heard of mate this, mate that. Tonight was the first night I've seen a mate straw. You may be husband and wife, but it doesn't mean she shows you everything. This is a cup, and it's full up to here with mate and a little sugar. But you drink it through that. You see those little holes? I never saw one of these before today. I'm already hooked. You may hold that.
Thank you, dear. Good.
There you go.
And so I should let this sit for a little minute because the water's hot. But what's cool about mate, I didn't want to cut you off. Or
Go ahead.
What's cool about mate is there's no caffeine in it. It tastes very healthy. It doesn't do anything to you really, but you can sit and sip it all night long because you just keep pouring hot water over it and using the same herbs, and then eventually you kind of throw those away and get new ones. But it's delicious, and I think that it's probably quite healthy for you. And this always reminds me of the soldiers' drink. A lot of the soldiers drink this when they're at their checkpoints and outposts.
May I?
Please. Might burn you, so be careful.
I can get the drift. Well, the wife of my mechanic gave me a present. They had done a little work on this old pickup truck, put a muffler system on it, which I didn't go 2 days without wrecking it. So I was picking up, I had to pay him some money. I went over to the house and she gave me this.
Can you read it?
It says, "You might be a redneck if your phone is mobile, but your truck isn't." From Virginia to whoever who's watching, sometimes this is oh so true.
Thank you, honey. Well, I'm gonna draw it to a close.
I was gonna get Little Dog.
And hold on. The show. This is the show, folks. So we were talking about why the U.S. is in Syria. We basically covered that each of those countries, whether it be the U.S., France, Germany, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Israel, of course, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, they all have their own agendas for being in Syria. They're all in Syria for bad reasons. None of them are doing anything good in Syria. They all need to get out of Syria. The reason Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah are there is they've literally been helping the Syrian government, the Syrian army, protect the Syrian people from terrorist groups that are sponsored by the aggressor countries. So I hope we did something that made some sense tonight. Just a quick reiteration of a point. We talked last week about how Israel and the U.S. are one being, basically now in foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East. Israel particularly wants Syria punished, weakened, bruised, beaten. In fact, one of their diplomats said that their intention is that Syria bleed and hemorrhage to death. So Israel doesn't care that people are dying there. They don't, in fact, they are supporting quite openly Al-Qaeda there, and there's strong evidence that they're supporting ISIS. The U.S. is supporting Al-Qaeda and ISIS, of course, as well. This is Little Dog, and he's the official distraction from my very serious talk here. When I say that the U.S. is not doing anything good in Syria and has no good purpose, let me end with one story. The story is this, that in Deir ez-Zor, you guys are great, in Deir ez-Zor in 2016, the Syrian Arab Army was holding a very important position at a hill called Al-Tharda. And Deir ez-Zor is where ISIS was very, very strong. Of course, that was their main area that they controlled in Syria. And the Syrian army had held this position. Thank you so much, honey. The Syrian army had held this position for a long time, almost 2 years, I believe. It was well marked, well established. The U.S. of America, the United States of America, and Australia was involved as well. They started hitting that Syrian army position brutally. They massacred almost 100 Syrian soldiers that day. Syrian soldiers who had been fighting ISIS for a long time. the U.S. did, bombing and strafing runs for an hour or more there, and they obliterated the Syrian army position. Immediately, that strategic hill that was near the airfield at Deir ez-Zor was captured by ISIS in what can really only be described as a coordinated move. And again and again and again, we've had stories of these situations. One of the Syrian Air Force pilots who was fighting ISIS was shot down, and he was given a great award by the U.S. We've had incidences of the U.S. evacuating ISIS commanders off the battlefield. We have, of course, the U.S. had made deals with ISIS fighters and commanders at Raqqa and let a lot of them go free. The ISIS stronghold in the south is near the Al-Tanf base that's controlled by the U.S. military, and that refugee center that's also controlled by the U.S. is one of the major recruiting points and training places for ISIS fighters. So when you say, when people are pondering whether the U.S. should get out of Syria, I'll leave it to you to answer that question. Not only should we get out of Syria's chair, to hearken back to the story from the UN with Ambassador Corey, we need to get out of their country, but also, I believe, I'm an American, I know what has happened in Syria, and I don't want to let this lie and let the U.S. say, oh, we were victorious against ISIS, we're getting out. Yes, get out. Whatever you want to say, get out. Syria reparations, big time reparations, literally billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars for what we set about to do in that country, for no good reason, for no good excuse, for nothing, no good consequences. Syria is a good country, great people. They are not, have never been a threat to the U.S. They have never wanted to be a threat to the U.S. They only ever wanted good, positive, mutually respectful, and beneficial relations, as a matter of fact. I feel like I keep saying the same things over, but I'm just trying to get people to wake up and try to think of ways that might help them, that might resonate for them to wake up. So here's my mate. Wish Sid was still here. We kind of arranged that. It was supposed to come a little bit later, but I messed that one up. Anyway, cheers to all of you. Cheers to Syria. God bless you, First Lady Asma, who just got out of surgery for her breast cancer today. And Syria, you have a lot of fans and people around the world that support you and love you. And we even love the things that you drink and the things that you eat and all of that stuff. So cheers, everyone, and have a good evening. And please send your comments, send your questions, and I'll try to answer each and every one of them before the end of tomorrow. Have a good night. Bye.